Hello, hope everybody had a good lunch. My name is Elise Kohn, and I'm the head of gynecologic and neuroendocrine cancer therapies in the Cancer Therapy Evaluation Program of the National Cancer Institute, and it is a true pleasure to be here to tell you about one of my favorite things, which are clinical trials. I don't have any disclosures. So clinical trials are a frustrating challenge because only 3 to 4% of adults with cancer participate in trials, as opposed to almost all pediatric cancer patients. And we think that maybe even as many as half of adults with cancer could be eligible. And it's clinical trials that change the standards of care that we give to patients across the board. It's also important to encourage everyone to participate in clinical trials because that's how we make progress. Unfortunately, neuroendocrine tumors, NETs, are increasing in frequency as we see on these graphs from 1973 to 2012, especially those that are in the lung, the pancreas, and in the bowel. What does that mean for us? It means that there's a continued and great need for progress so that we can have the right approaches for all of these patients who are now dealing with a pancreatic or lung or GI or other neuroendocrine tumor. If we look at advances in these diseases, we can see, starting on the left, even by decade here, very little progress. But then since the beginning of the 2010s, we've seen progressive progress in identifying new drug interventions for patients with a variety of different kinds of neuroendocrine tumors. This is based on clinical trial participation, evaluating these potential treatments. So let's break this down. What do clinical trials actually do? They test new ideas that are focused to make a difference for patients, for their outcome. So what is a clinical trial? The World Health Organization has a pretty complex definition, which I've paraphrased on the bottom, as a research study in which people participate in one or more health-related interventions that evaluate a predetermined outcome. So I think that this treatment makes sense for this kind of patient in this setting. I lock everything in ahead of time, that's the predetermined outcome and the health-related intervention, and then I seek participation. So when should you or we participate in a clinical trial? Well, really, any time. There's a misconception that clinical trials are really only for patients who are at the end of the rope with no other options. Well, that's completely not true. We have clinical trials to prevent cancer. We have clinical trials to treat a patient before they get a surgical removal of their cancer or radiation removal of their cancer. We have clinical trials of that surgery or radiation, trials of treatment right after definitive surgery or radiation, and also for patients who have recurrences. So anytime. Why clinical trials? Well, a clinical trial allows a progressive assessment of intervention so that we can study just the effect of a drug or radiation or imaging or any of the things that we want to include. Clinical trials are in a stepped fashion so that we can learn what we need to learn as clearly as we can while minimizing the number of patients and maximizing safety and contribution of those patients in order to provide evidence that can be applied to decisions made by you and your physicians in shared decision making. Another reason that we kind of tell you under the table is that sometimes the care and oversight that you have as a clinical trials participant is actually greater than you would have in a routine practice because there's a requirement for patient monitoring and data collection. So Who does clinical trials? Any physician who's trained properly in regulatory and safety guidelines, either working with a company or under a government grant or system, can do clinical trials. And even us at the National Institutes of Health have a research-only hospital called the NIH Clinical Center, where we can bring patients in, pay for their travel from all over the country and sometimes all over the world for a trial that we may be running. So there are many more opportunities than you realize. And here at the University of Kentucky, there's a very big clinical trials program. Who participates in clinical trials? Well, again, I want to reinforce anybody can. Anybody who's willing and interested, who fulfills those predetermined criteria where we're trying to maximize safety and information gathering in the fewest number of trial participants. But some trials even are open to patients we call normal volunteers. Those may be folks who have no cancer, but are willing to take a dose of a drug so we can measure how the healthy body handles that drug. So who should participate in clinical trials? Everyone. It's always worth asking. I realize that sometimes it's difficult feasibly because you may live a long way from a center, but we think it's important for everyone to be aware that we're trying to increase the opportunities for patients so that everybody can be in a clinical trial. So what are the clinical trial phases? The first is to know that they test different questions that build upon one another, and the purpose of each kind of trial is different. Phase 1 trials are about safety and determining dose and schedule. Phase 2 is about optimizing dose and schedule, but looking at activity in a narrower group of patients who are more alike in terms of their disease. And at phase 3, we're comparing against the standard of care to determine if we've actually made that improvement or equivalent. What do different clinical trial phases do? Well, let's go through it in a little more detail. In phase 1, we want to understand the safety of the intervention and the doses to use. It may be a first time a human has ever had the drug, or it may be well-known drugs that are being given in a different fashion. So the trial may be open to a wide array of cancer types if it's a brand new drug or idea, or it may be a narrow group, for example, just NETs, if we're testing how to modify something like as Lutathera PRRT. But safety is the primary focus while we're still looking for benefit. What do different clinical trial phases do in phase 2? Well, phase 2 is the next step up. Here we have a consistent dose and schedule, and we want generally to treat a more consistent population of patients, a more homogeneous group. And here we're looking for signs of activity and continue measurements of safety. They can either be that everybody gets the same drug, or a randomization or assignment to different arms based on the type of disease or the type of gene changes or the type of drug. And then, as I said before, phase 3 is the definitive study. Phase 3 is where we compare this new promising approach that we've got in the safest possible form, and we've already got a strong hint that there's important activity. And here we're going to compare it against the standard of care because we want to find if this is equivalent or better than the standard. Sometimes the treatment is blinded, which means you don't know what you're getting, and neither do your doctors. That's the cleanest trial because then folks are just open to whatever happens. And sometimes we use a placebo control, which means that we're blinding what you're getting in a different fashion. And again, that's to get the cleanest, most useful data so that we know that we're really making a difference or not. And I think that's really critical. But it also means that in each step, there is an informed consent that has to describe the cancer and the treatments and the purpose of that trial, which can sometimes feel a little bit daunting. What goes into designing a clinical trial? Well, the most important thing is to have data to scientifically justify doing this, because it's an experiment. We don't want to do it just because it's there, but because we have evidence suggesting it makes sense to test the question in people. So in the cartoon, we found a mass, and the good news is we have weapons of mass destruction, and that's kind of how I think of clinical trials, but we want the weapon of mass destruction to be pertinent to the mass. We want to make it a clinically meaningful finding. We don't want to do a study that's testing Tweedledee against Tweedledum, because that's not going to advance and help patients. But we want to make sure that the advance that we're seeking is worth the effort and the risk of adding or adjusting the plan. We want it to be purposeful. It has to be of interest to us, the patients. If it's not, nobody's going to participate, whether it's beneficial or not. So we want to make sure that we're addressing a need that we as patients perceive as important, not just we as the healthcare providers. What goes into designing a clinical trial? Well, if it's scientifically strong, it can make a clinically meaningful difference, and the community is interested, it's got to be feasible. And as you can see in my cartoon, if you can't swallow the pill, it's not feasible. So we want to make sure that we address all these elements in our design. It's important to recognize there are a lot of exciting new directions in neuroendocrine cancer treatment. The first is PRRT, or Lutathera, or lutetium dotatate, which we've all heard a lot about. And what I've done is I've taken some pictures here. This is what we look at as the healthcare providers, but I'm going to kind of tell you how people determined that this was a significant advance. Progression-free time means the time that from when you start a treatment until the disease gets worse or it goes away. And then we measure that over time. So you can see here on the bottom, it's out to 2.5 years. And what you see is the patients who got the Lutathera, the lutetium dotatate, they had a much slower time to their tumor progressing compared to patients who got the control. In this case, it was octreotide. So that's a really big difference. That's a monstrous and awesome difference. But on the other side, we looked at how did it affect the overall survival for these patients, and you can see eventually it comes together. But even at the 2.5 year mark, which is the time frame on the left, there's still a big difference. So there's something special about lutetium dotatate for patients who have GI neuroendocrine tumors. However, it doesn't appear to be curing a dramatic number of patients, which means that we can take new clinical trials to try and improve upon it. And that's exactly what your colleagues here at the University of Kentucky and elsewhere are doing right now, trying to improve on this benefit. An alternative way to do it is to take what people are doing. In this case, in pancreatic neuroendocrine cancers, we tested temozolomide, which is what folks were using, and Dr. Kunz and her colleagues asked, can they make it better with the addition of capecitabine? What was great is both of these are oral agents, and here you can see that the addition of capecitabine to temozolomide really made a difference in the time to progression of the pancreatic neuroendocrine cancer. So that sets us up to ask our next questions, which are, how does this stand up to the Lutathera we just looked at? When is the best time to use this in the life cycle of the disease? So every advance we make brings on new questions upon which we can build. And that's what this busy slide is about. It's not the specifics, but it's trying to show you where different kinds of trials can be in these new collection of trials that we're doing. We can build on what I just showed you of capecitabine and temozolomide by thinking about perhaps even using it right after definitive surgery in a group of patients who we know have a high risk of recurrence. If they have a high risk of recurrence and we give them what we call adjuvant treatment, can we delay the recurrence or maybe even cure some of the patients. And that's a clinical trial that has just opened. Can we build a better mousetrap? Can we improve on Lutathera PRRT and determine also for whom it's best? So we're testing it in the less common nets, such as bronchial cancer, but we're also adding novel agents in early development, like phase 1 and 2, to see if we can improve upon it. We have approvals and we have knowledge that the drugs that affect blood vessel formation are important in neuroendocrine cancers. But can we find something that's even better? And in that case, we're testing cabozantinib, which is a different type of blood vessel inhibitor. And then lastly, one of the things that's really been frustrating for all of us is that, especially in the neuroendocrine carcinomas, the really aggressive ones, we've always treated them the way we treat small cell lung cancer, but they're really not identical. So now we're going to take that small cell lung cancer approach and we're going to test it specifically in NETs to determine if immunotherapy is hype or value. So what I showed you before, this somewhat disappointing but now increasing set of progress, has led to a really busy collection of clinical trials. And the whole purpose here is not for you to scribble down and write these down, but I want you to feel the optimism of the fact that we're testing the value of using treatment immediately after surgery to have an impact. We're testing different kinds of therapies across different kinds of NETs. We're trying to improve on Lutathera. We're trying to determine when is best to give it. We're also trying to advance into the other types of NETs and to the more rare paraganglioma and pheochromocytoma. And you can find out more about these by going to clinicaltrials.gov and or speaking with your doctor's office. And of course, you're always welcome to reach out to any of us who are involved in the clinical trials to determine what the best step is. I purposely made this short because I think it's going to be important for us to have a fair amount of time to talk about what I offered and to answer general questions related to clinical trial opportunities for patients with neuroendocrine cancers. And one of the reasons why these clinical trials are so important is because, as the mouse is saying, I go home today. They cured me using this miracle drug. I'm afraid it'll be years before it's approved in humans. But what comes between the mouse and the approval for humans are these important clinical trials. Thank you very much.